When Floyd Mayweather speaks about boxing, people don't just listen casually, they analyze every word, every pause, and every implication behind what he says, because his understanding of the sport goes far beyond what most fighters or fans can see, and that's exactly why his recent comments about Gervonta Davis and Shakur Stevenson didn't just create headlines, they created tension, because instead of giving the expected answer or showing clear support for Tank, he approached the question in a way that felt calculated, almost like he was revealing something uncomfortable about how this fight might actually play out if it ever happens. At first, the idea that Tank Davis could struggle against anyone is difficult for many fans to accept, because his reputation has been built on dominance, explosive knockouts, and the kind of power that doesn't just win fights but ends them suddenly, often before the opponent has time to fully adjust, and that reputation has created a belief that no matter what happens in the early rounds, Tank always has the ability to change everything with a single moment, making him one of the most feared fighters in the sport today. But Shakur Stevenson represents a completely different kind of challenge, one that doesn't rely on power or aggression in the traditional sense, but instead focuses on control, precision, and an almost frustrating ability to dictate the pace of a fight, making opponents feel like they are constantly one step behind, unable to find the rhythm or timing they need to be effective, and it's this style that Mayweather seemed to highlight as a potential problem for Tank. What makes this matchup so fascinating, and at the same time so difficult to predict with complete confidence, is the fact that it isn't simply a case of power versus skill in the basic sense that fans often describe, but rather a much deeper clash of approaches, philosophies, and mental frameworks that shape how each fighter operates under pressure. Because while Gervonta Davis thrives in moments of chaos where a single opening can be turned into a fight-ending sequence, Shakur Stevenson exists on the opposite end of that spectrum, building his success through control, structure, and the ability to remove chaos from the equation entirely. And when those two styles meet, the outcome is rarely determined by who is stronger or faster, but by who is able to impose their preferred conditions over the course of the fight, which is exactly where Mayweather's analysis becomes so interesting, because he isn't questioning Tank's ability in a general sense, he's questioning whether Tank would be able to create the kind of moments he relies on against someone who was specifically designed to prevent those moments from ever happening, and that raises a much more complex question than simply asking who would win, because it forces you to consider not just what each fighter can do, but what happens when one fighter's greatest strength is directly neutralized by the other's greatest advantage. Mayweather's perspective seems to come from an understanding that at the highest level of boxing, the difference between winning and losing often comes down to the smallest details, the subtle adjustments, the ability to recognize patterns and disrupt them before they fully develop, and in a fight between Tank Davis and Shakur Stevenson, those details would likely become the central focus of the entire contest, because while Tank's power is undeniable, it still depends on timing, positioning, and opportunity, all of which are areas where Stevenson excels defensively, making it extremely difficult for opponents to land clean shots without first going through a process of breaking down his control, and that process is not something that happens quickly or easily, especially against a fighter who has built his entire style around maintaining distance, minimizing risk, and forcing his opponents into uncomfortable positions where they are constantly reacting rather than initiating, and this is where the potential problem for Tank begins to emerge, not because he lacks ability, but because he may find himself in a situation where his usual approach doesn't produce the same results, forcing him to adapt in ways that he hasn't consistently needed to before. Another layer to this discussion that often goes unnoticed is the psychological aspect of how both fighters handle control within a fight, because boxing is not just about physical exchanges, it's about who feels in command of the moment, who is dictating the pace, and who is forcing the other to operate outside of their comfort zone, and in this regard, Stevenson has shown a consistent ability to remain composed even when facing aggressive opponents, maintaining a level of discipline that prevents fights from becoming unpredictable, while Tank, on the other hand, has built his success on capitalizing on those unpredictable moments, turning small mistakes into major consequences, and when those two mental approaches collide, the question becomes not just whether Tank can land a punch, but whether he can create the kind of environment where that punch becomes possible in the first place, because if Stevenson is able to maintain his structure and avoid giving those opportunities, the fight could slowly shift into a scenario where Tank is forced to chase rather than control, and that shift in dynamic can have a significant impact over the course of multiple rounds. There is also the factor of patience, which becomes increasingly important in matchups where one fighter is trying to break through a highly disciplined defense, because patience is not simply about waiting, it's about maintaining focus and making the right decisions over time, even when the fight is not unfolding in your favor. And this is an area where Stevenson's style naturally creates challenges, as he has the ability to extend fights into longer, more strategic contests where frustration can begin to influence decision-making. And if Tank were to find himself in that kind of situation, the question would be whether he could remain disciplined enough to stick to a long-term strategy, or whether he might take risks in an attempt to force an outcome. And those risks, while potentially dangerous for Stevenson, could also create openings in the opposite direction, making the fight more complex than a simple comparison of strengths. What makes Mayweather's comments feel almost shocking to some fans is not that he is dismissing Tank's abilities, but that he is highlighting the possibility that even the most dangerous fighters can encounter situations where their usual advantages are reduced, and in boxing, those situations often define careers, because they reveal how adaptable a fighter truly is when faced with a style that challenges their identity inside the ring. And in this case, Stevenson represents exactly that kind of challenge, not through overwhelming offense, but through control, discipline, and an ability to disrupt rhythm, all of which combine to create a scenario where the fight could become less about explosive moments and more about sustained execution over time. And that shift in focus is what makes the potential matchup so compelling, because it introduces variables that cannot be easily predicted or simplified. Another important dimension that adds weight to Mayweather's perspective is the idea that styles like Stevenson's don't just challenge opponents physically, they slowly take control of the fight mentally. And this is something that often isn't obvious in highlight clips or short breakdowns, because it happens gradually, round by round, as the opponent begins to realize that the openings they rely on simply aren't appearing in the way they expected. And this realization can create a subtle but powerful shift in mindset, where confidence starts to turn into hesitation, and patience begins to feel like pressure. And in a fight against someone like Stevenson, who thrives on maintaining that structure and consistency, that mental shift can be just as important as any physical exchange, because once a fighter starts second-guessing their timing or their approach, even the smallest delays can make a significant difference in whether a punch lands cleanly or misses entirely. For Gervonta Davis, this kind of situation would represent a unique test of adaptability, because while he has shown the ability to remain dangerous throughout a fight, even when things are not going perfectly, the specific challenge of dealing with a highly disciplined, defensively responsible opponent requires a different kind of adjustment, one that goes beyond power and instinct, and moves into the realm of strategy and long-term planning, where each round becomes part of a larger process, rather than a series of isolated moments. And this is where the fight could become particularly interesting, because it would force Tank to operate in a space where immediate results are not guaranteed, and where success depends on the ability to build opportunities over time rather than waiting for them to appear naturally. At the same time, it would be a mistake to assume that Stevenson's style guarantees control without risk, because maintaining that level of discipline over the course of an entire fight requires constant focus and precision, and against a fighter with Tank's level of power, even a single lapse in concentration can have significant consequences, which means that while Stevenson may have the tools to limit opportunities, he must also remain aware that those tools need to function consistently under pressure, and that balance between control and awareness adds another layer of complexity to the matchup, because it creates a scenario where both fighters are operating under different but equally demanding conditions. What makes Mayweather's comments resonate so strongly is the fact that they reflect a deeper understanding of how fights evolve beyond the early rounds, because while initial impressions often focus on speed, power, and immediate exchanges, the later stages of a fight tend to reveal which fighter is better able to adapt, maintain discipline, and execute a strategy under fatigue. And in a matchup like this, those later rounds could become the defining factor, especially if the fight remains competitive without a clear advantage for either side, as the ability to stay consistent and avoid mistakes becomes increasingly important. There is also the question of tempo, which plays a crucial role in determining how comfortable each fighter feels throughout the fight, because controlling the pace doesn't just influence the physical rhythm, it affects decision-making, energy management, and overall confidence. And if Stevenson is able to establish a tempo that limits exchanges and forces Tank into a more measured approach, it could reduce the frequency of high-impact moments, which in turn could influence how the fight is scored and perceived, while at the same time increasing the importance of accuracy and efficiency. On the other hand, if Tank is able to disrupt that tempo and create moments of unpredictability, even in short bursts, it could shift the dynamic in his favor, because unpredictability introduces risk, and risk can create opportunities that structured fighters prefer to avoid, and this push and pull between control and disruption is what makes the potential matchup so compelling, because it creates a constant battle not just of skills, but of intentions, where each fighter is trying to impose a completely different version of how the fight should unfold. Another factor that cannot be ignored is experience at handling different styles, because while both fighters have faced a variety of opponents throughout their careers, the specific combination of attributes that each brings into this matchup is relatively unique, and that uniqueness means that both would likely encounter situations they haven't fully experienced before, requiring adjustments that go beyond their established patterns, and those adjustments often determine the outcome of high-level fights more than any single strength or advantage. This is where Mayweather's analysis becomes particularly valuable, because it shifts the conversation away from surface-level comparisons and toward a deeper examination of how those adjustments might play out in real time, highlighting the importance of adaptability, awareness, and the ability to recognize when a strategy needs to change, all of which are essential at the highest level of the sport. For fans, this creates a more complex and engaging narrative, because instead of focusing solely on who hits harder or who looks more impressive in highlights, it encourages a deeper understanding of the sport, where the outcome is shaped by a combination of physical ability, mental discipline, and strategic execution, all interacting in ways that can be difficult to predict. It also reinforces a truth about boxing that many fans don't fully accept until they see it happen in real time, which is that no fighter, no matter how dominant they appear, is perfectly built for every possible matchup, because styles create problems, and certain styles are specifically designed to neutralize strengths that seem unstoppable in other situations. And in the case of a potential fight between Tank Davis and Shakur Stevenson, this becomes especially relevant, because while Tank's power has proven to be a decisive factor against many opponents, the question is not whether that power exists, but whether it can be consistently applied against someone who has built their entire approach around avoiding exactly that kind of impact. And this is where the conversation shifts from admiration to analysis, from highlights to reality, because it forces a deeper examination of what actually happens when two highly specialized skill sets collide, and whether dominance in one context can truly carry over into another that demands a completely different kind of performance. As the discussion around this matchup continues to grow, it becomes increasingly clear that what makes it so compelling is not the certainty of an outcome, but the uncertainty of how it would unfold, because both fighters bring qualities that are not only effective, but potentially disruptive to the other's game plan, creating a scenario where every round could introduce new adjustments, new strategies, and new challenges that neither fighter can fully prepare for in advance, and this evolving nature of the fight is what elevates it beyond a simple comparison of strengths, turning it into a dynamic contest where the ability to think, adapt, and remain composed under pressure becomes just as important as physical skill. And in that sense, the fight becomes less about proving who is better in a general sense, and more about determining who can navigate the specific conditions created by the matchup itself. In the end, what Floyd Mayweather's comments have done is shift the entire conversation from a surface-level debate into something much deeper, something that challenges assumptions and encourages a more complete understanding of how boxing actually works at the highest level, because instead of focusing on what fans expect to happen, it asks a more important question about what could happen when two fighters with very different approaches are forced to operate in the same space, under the same pressure, with everything on the line. And while there may never be a definitive answer until the fight takes place, the value of this discussion lies in the way it reveals the complexity of the sport, highlighting the fact that greatness is not just about power or skill alone, but about the ability to adapt, to think, and to execute under conditions that are constantly changing. And it is the deeper layer of understanding that transforms a simple matchup into a truly compelling story.